This is Solasta, Crown of the Magister. I'm leaving that in, actually. Can you imagine a plot with what seems to be the main antagonist is actually not the bad guy, and it turns out his clown is the big bad guy all along? I guess, actually, that's basically Devil May Cry 3's plot, isn't it? Alright, moving on. Solasta is a CRPG using the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons rule set, and that means, to probably get this out of the way at first, yes, the comparisons to Baldur's Gate 3 are kind of inevitable, unfortunately, because they are both CRPGs and early access at the same time. Both of them are using the 5th edition D&D rules. But really, besides those very surface level comparisons, the rule set being the same, and they're both being the same genre, they're really not that similar. Honestly, I like both of them, and they're both definitely worth playing, and a Baldur's Gate 3 video is coming in the future. But one thing that sets Solasta apart from something like that, and in fact, in my opinion, from just about any CRPG before, is the fact that it feels like less of an adaptation of those pen and paper D&D rules and more like a direct translation, with almost every mechanic in the game being themed around a mechanic from the tabletop. It feels a lot less like they've sort of adapted pen and paper rules to a video game form, and more that they have just directly ported over those pen and paper rules to a video game form. So pretty much everything in it feels exactly like it does in the pen and paper, which is actually pretty admirable, because you don't have to do that to make a good CRPG, and there are many of them that are very much in the adaptation camp. Pretty much all of the classics like the Baldur's Gate games, Neverwinter Nights, Icewind Dale, those sorts of things are video game adaptations of 3.5 D&D rules, but there's something to be said about a game that's going for more of a direct translation, and especially when it pulls it off this well. For example, you have rules like the cover rules that are taken directly from the pen and paper, so instead of having a sort of half cover and full cover, like how sort of the XCOM version of somewhat simplified cover rules go, which tends to work just fine in a video game, really, and even Baldur's Gate 3 uses that sort of adaptation. This goes for the direct translation of having all 3 layers of cover simulated. So you have half cover, 3/4 cover, and full cover, with full cover actually making the character in question unable to be hit by ranged attacks at all from the correct direction. So it does definitely go for exactly how the pen and paper rules do it, just translated to a video game form, which is pretty neat, and you'll find that to be the case in just about everything, even with simple stuff like skill check rolls spontaneously happening during dialogue scenes and things like that, not only for options that you choose to actually roll, but stuff that just sort of happens naturally, exactly how it would in the pen and paper. If your DM is giving you some sort of story, one of your characters may have a sort of passive roll on their, an intelligence history check, for instance, to determine the origin of a statue and what it represents. That sort of thing is actually simulated in this game as well. Sometimes you'll just walk up to something and a roll from your characters will just happen without you actually choosing it, to actually determine how they feel about it or what they say about it, or if they discover something about it based on the skills and knowledge that they have. So you do have stuff like your intelligence history and intelligence perception rolls happening passively as you explore places, and of course your more direct stuff like choosing certain dialogue options which will roll against specific things, and other passive rolls while exploring, like trap detection rolls and that sort of thing. So it definitely, it has that pen and paper feel all over it, with how all of the mechanics work being a very direct translation of how they would work in a pen and paper setting. As for the setting itself, this is another difference from Baldur's Gate 3 in that it does not take place in an established D&D setting like the Forgotten Realms, and it in fact takes place in its own new created setting of Solasta, which has a bit of a dark history with some imperial forces and horrible magic experiments and dark things happening in the past and sort of coming back around again, and that is of course when this particular adventure begins to take place, is when all of this is sort of poised to come back. And a lot of the early game that is currently in the early access is experiencing uncovering that past and trying to make sense of it, and then seeing how it's coming back around at this point. And I'm guessing in the second and third acts of the game we're going to see more of this history actually coming back, with some crazy characters and some other monstrous enemies and things that have been mentioned here and there being more directly responsible for actions in the campaign. And I should probably go ahead and mention that the early access right now is fairly short, but not insubstantial. It has about 3 pretty sizable dungeons in it. It's effectively the first act of the game, and it covers character levels up to 6, which may not sound like a lot if you're used to playing other kinds of RPGs, but in a Dungeons & Dragons based CRPG, 6 levels is actually pretty high, and leveling in this game does take quite a while, as again, a very direct translation of how those mechanics work from the pen and paper. So yeah, 6 levels is actually quite a lot, and you will notice a very distinct increase in power per each level, as is traditional for D&D, where every single level makes a pretty big difference because you have large leaps in power each time. So something like just 6 levels is actually quite a lot of difference in power and new stuff for each of your characters to learn. As for the characters themselves, there are pre-mades if you want to just sort of go into a campaign quickly. There are pre-made characters of each class for you to try out, but the main meat of the game is, of course, in creating a squad of characters yourself. You have 4 slots, so your adventuring party will be 4 characters, and there are quite a few character creation options. The character creation in general, and this is just really pleasant because it's very nicely presented. I will say that probably the best aspect of the game visually is its presentation. It's presented with this really nice sort of flat menu style, and everything actually mimics the look of character sheets and like physical sheets that you would be circling all of these things on what their proficiencies are and all that. It's all represented in a very visual way that looks nice. Even things like the inventory do have that sort of character sheet-like appearance. Rolling up stats for your character is done quite physically, with all of this, the dice rolls being like physical things that you drag to each of the stats that you want to assign them. It's all presented nicely, and in-game, the combat and exploration user interface has this nice sort of square flat style where everything is squares. Your individual actions are differently sized squares, your spell slots are represented as glowing squares, your movement is represented as squares, and the very flat shaded, kind of slightly blurred, nice looking panel style of all the options creates this really cohesive, nice style for the user interface, which is one of the things that's actually really important in a CRPG, because you're going to be interfacing with these buttons and menus and stuff a lot. It's an RPG, so menus are just as important as the actual in-game graphical display of your characters and things. So it's nice to see a user interface that has a nice unified art style with this sort of nice flat look. You have quite a good number of options between classes and races to choose from, but I will say that some of my favorites are missing, like for instance no Warlock, which is unfortunate, although there are currently some stretch goals, I believe, that involve more classes being put in, so I can't really say what will or will not be in the final game because I don't really think anyone knows that yet, but right now you do still have a pretty good selection of classes, and as you'd expect, each class also has usually a choice between like 3 different sort of subclasses or domains or specializations or whatever it is that that particular class has, that enables further customization options and further features at higher levels. Generally speaking, once you hit level 3 or so, you'll be able to select some sort of specialized subclass or something like that for each individual character to help develop them further. As for the combat with these characters, that's definitely the meat of the game. The combat is a really nicely varied experience, and it does use as I mentioned, some of the classic cover rules and of course your movement square rules and all that directly from D&D. All dice rolls are actually visible. They are represented as a die of that particular number of sides rolling so that you can see exactly how the rolls resolve yourself. Even things like the damage rolls have their own dice that are displayed alongside the to-hit roll if it actually hits. And you can even go so deep as to specifically customize the look of each individual element of damage rolls. So if you want your radiant damage dice and your force damage dice to have a specific appearance separate from everything else, you can actually do that, which is a really nice bit of customization that you can specifically customize every type of dice roll and its appearance. That's really neat, actually. And again, very much shows the commitment to being as direct a translation of these mechanics as possible to a video game form. The combat in this game has a large focus on verticality and light. Almost none of the combat encounters that I've been in so far have been on flat surfaces. Pretty much every single arena that you will fight things in has multiple levels of height. Even while camping, being ambushed while camping, generally you won't be in a flat field. You'll have some sort of rocky outcrops or maybe like a small wooden tower with a ladder, stuff like that adds extra verticality to all of the combat encounters, and you can indeed push people off and like insta-kill them from high drops, because it also uses the normal D&D falling damage calculations, which means a drop of more than like 3 or 4 tiles does severe damage to you. And in fact, before a patch, you could actually be pushed off of stuff by enemies as well, which I thought was hilarious, but they did take it out temporarily while they balance it. So that won't happen to you for now, but you can still push enemies around, which is fun. And light is also just as important because it uses those rules as well. So dim light has a severe penalty to hit things in it, and of course pure darkness, you pretty much won't be hitting anything at all in that. So carrying torches and stuff is very important, which is why every character starts with some sort of light source, like a candle or a torch, and it does use the rules in exactly the way that you would think. So for instance, a torch casts bright light in 4 tiles and then dim light for a further 4 tiles. And you do also have to worry about stuff like dark vision enabled enemies getting advantageous hits on you in the dark and things like that. So illuminating different things is very important, and there are a lot of interactive elements in the arenas you'll fight in as well. Stuff like lights that you can trigger with spellcasts, so you can be under one of these lights and leave it off so that ranged enemies can't hit you as easily, but then use like a quick cantrip to light one above an enemy so that they have a disadvantage and can get hit easier. And there are also stuff like the description of the store page even mentions stuff like walls and columns that can be pushed over onto enemies. I've seen several like stone blocks that can be pushed onto enemies that are underneath them. And of course you combine this with all of the skills, abilities, spells, and everything that your characters will have in your party of 4, and with all of the different types of enemies that you'll be facing, and that means the combat is definitely a very tactical affair with a lot of very careful movement, some really important turns where a lot of stuff can happen at once, and it's just a really varied, nicely crafted combat system that uses the verticality and light rules to actually matter quite a lot from turn to turn, and also these extra interactive elements in the areas to provide that little bit of extra spice to silly things that can happen during combat, like luring the tankiest of the enemies that you're facing to the edge of some sort of large cliff and then just pushing them off instead of trying to whittle them down slowly. Stuff like that is just really enjoyable to figure out, to feel like each individual combat is very much a puzzle, and you want to solve it as efficiently as possible so that you don't have a whole bunch of like heavily injured characters with very few spell slots and ability slots left over after battle. And this does also accurately simulate the short and long rest rules, with even you have to individually click and roll your own hit dice after a rest to restore your hit points if you have any missing and stuff like that. So it does simulate all of that completely accurately, which is nice. It even goes so far as to show the individual rolls. If someone rolls with advantage or disadvantage on something, it shows both dice rolls and then selecting the correct one depending on if you're talking about an advantageous or disadvantageous roll. So it's definitely putting a lot of effort forward into making sure that just about every mechanical aspect of the pen and paper rule set is simulated in some sort of accurate way here to really give you the feeling that you are adventuring with a party, that you are kind of the DM and you're in control of everyone, and that everything works. If you know the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition rule set, pretty much nothing will surprise you in terms of the mechanics of the combat, the exploration, the skill checks and all that, because it all works exactly like it should. I can't really say too much about the story yet because there's not a whole lot of it in the game, although it does very clearly revolve around this crown and this imperial past, the history of this world coming back around to some very dark things occurring. But as far as the specifics on a lot of that, there's just not enough of that in the game yet to really comment. To get the obvious comparison out of the way, yes, of course, it doesn't look as good as Baldur's Gate 3. The character models aren't as high quality. The areas look nice, but they aren't as just cluttered with stuff. Baldur's Gate 3 is gorgeous. Let's just get that out of the way right off the gate and just say that from the start. That game looks extremely good. But this is also a game made by a much smaller team with a much smaller budget, so the audio-visual limitations of that budget, I feel, can be excused for how lovingly crafted the actual mechanical and role-playing simulation is. Overall, it's just a really solid CRPG that does a lot towards making itself as accurate as possible to the rule set that it's pulling from, and I think there's a lot to say about how well it goes about this goal and how well it achieves it. I think that there's room for a lot more CRPGs in the scene, so I'd rather not compare this to others as a way to say which one is better, because just like in the heyday of this genre with like the original Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights and Icewind Dale series, Arcanum, if you want to go there, which I do even though it's super buggy, it was best to have as many as possible and then play and enjoy them all as being different experiences, and I would like to see that come back. This is a genre that I really love and have a lot of history with, so seeing a time where we can actually talk about multiple of them at once actually coming out and being worth playing is super cool to actually, go through that again. So that is Solasta. I would definitely recommend it if you're a CRPG fan, and of course you're into the fact that it is early access. Not everything is available yet, but there's still a lot of mechanical variety in it to get a good amount of playtime, probably a good like 10 to 12 hours, depending on exactly, how much you want to do, if you want to create multiple characters and do things in different ways each time, stuff like that. And I'm definitely excited to see what the updates bring. There have already been some smaller like bug fixing and balancing updates, so they're working on it. All of that stuff has been pretty consistent, so hopefully we'll be seeing some larger content updates going into the next year, and eventually more acts and maybe more classes as it releases and stuff like that. So it's a really good CRPG, and I definitely would recommend that people try it out because it's accurate simulation of the pen and paper rule set is hard to find this accurately anywhere else. So that is Solasta. Thank you guys very much for watching. The link is in the description below this video if you want to go to the Steam store page and check it out yourself. If you just want to keep an eye on it and don't necessarily want to buy it yet because it's early access, just wishlist it, because wishlisting it will make sure you receive news of each of its major updates so you can track it that way, and wishlisting really does help the developers out, even if it might not seem like it. It is a good thing to do if you just to gauge interest in the product, basically. So check it out below. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.